Stable state, fragile state, failing state, failed state, collapsed state. Where is South Africa on this spectrum? Here to tell us is Dr. Edward Mienie from the University of North Georgia. He is also a former diplomat in both the National Party and African national governments. Welcome, Dr. Mienie.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, Chris. Thank you for the invite.
About 10 years ago, you wrote a doctoral thesis in which you concluded that South Africa was not stable, but was actually already in a latently fragile state. You reiterated that conclusion in your book about 2 years ago.
Yes.
Can you tell us whether we are still in a latently fragile state or whether we have now moved into being a failing state?
Yes. Thank you for the question. This is a very important topic, Chris, and I'm very happy that you invited me to speak about this issue. I think just basically in context, the reason that prompted my research was the fact that there's an outfit here in the state of Virginia, that Systemic Peace, that categorizes all the nations in the world according to their levels of stability or fragility. And according to them, they had categorized South Africa as being relatively stable. Being a native South African visiting South Africa annually for various purposes, family and others, I knew better. And so the question that prompted my research was, do existing measures of state fragility really measure state fragility? And so that was the research question. And I went on and used the human security theoretical framework and wanted to dig deeper down into where South Africa is, in fact, and not based on Systemic Peace's categorization. And so I look at things like threats to personal security, to community security, to environment security, to economic security, to political security. Threats that South Africans experience in those categories. And I found that at the time I come up with this term that South Africa was latently fragile, because on the surface, when you visit South Africa, and you land as a tourist in a beautiful airport building, and you use our highways, and you visit all the tourist spots, it looks like everything is normal and beautiful as South Africa is. But when one does life there, we discover a different side of what's really going on in South Africa. I look at South Africa for purposes of my research study in terms of a security system functional space. And I question myself the role that the government is supposed to play within this functional space. In other words, are they effectively exercising political oversight? Are they defending our South Africa's territorial integrity? Are they protecting the economic system? Are they preventing violent conflict? Do we make a contribution to international crisis management? I've seen some of our troops deployed in Africa on missions there. Does the state protect against internal and external threats? And then does it enforce national and international laws? So that was the security system functional space that I used for purposes of my research. And then the security system main actors, I categorize as the legislative bodies, in other words, Parliament, as being one group. Another group, executive authorities, in other words, the ministries within the South African government. The core security actors, external being armed forces and national intelligence. Then also non-statutory forces, such as private security companies, militias, gangs. Another category is the core security actors, internal. So this would be South African Police Service, Customs, Intelligence again. Another category is judicial penal. So this would include our courts system, our prisons, and then civil society, which includes media, non-governmental organizations, religious organizations, and unions. So using that, I visited South Africa and conducted some field research, and I used the mixed methods approach. So I looked at secondary data, which I accessed on open source, and I did quantitative secondary data analysis. This included government documents and everything else that one can find in open source sources, and conducted 45 semi-structured, lengthy interviews, which included government officials, security practitioners, members of parliament, and leading experts in the field. So my interviewees included people across the color line, across the gender divide, across the political divide. I was very intentional about that. And some of the main themes that came out of my interviews, two main ones, good governance kept on popping up. Within good governance, concerns about corruption within the South African government was a strong sub-theme that came out of good governance. In other words, contributing towards a good governance deficit. Another one, subcategory of good governance and threats to good governance, is crime syndicates. Remember, this is a study that I conducted 10 years ago. Political destabilization was another subcategory that came out based on the interviews that I conducted with my interviewees. The new social divide was a very strong subcategory threatening good governance in South Africa. And then social economic successes and challenges. Obviously, a challenge there is unemployment, the huge unemployment rate, which of concern the most to me is the category of South African citizens between the ages of 15 and 25. The guesstimate there is that the unemployment rate is in excess of 70%. That's 70. That's a very, very high degree of unemployment within that age group. The second main theory the second main theme that came out of my interviews was South Africa's security, our security system, that there is in fact a massive security system deficit in South Africa. We had a tremendous growth of our South African police services, and together with that came challenges. And the challenges, the themes that came out of my interviews conducted with those interviewees is that the South African police service lacks capacity and capability. That, because of that reason, because of that presence of incapacity and capability, lack of capability, it contributes to the lack of trust from the citizenry towards the South African government. Of course, it contributes to the rising crime statistics, which continues to rise in all categories, and especially violent crime. So those were the themes that came out of that. And within those themes, I identified a number of issues. For instance, there's the flawed application of identity group-based preferential treatment policies, otherwise known as affirmative action and Black economic empowerment. Another finding is that there's a backlog in court cases. We have a lack in South Africa of alternative dispute resolution mechanisms. Corruption in the South African police service and the criminal justice system is rife. And of course, we have a lack of public trust. South Africa has a huge private security sector, and it has grown exponentially over the years. Chris, would you like me to stop there for now?
I think I would just like to ask you, if we were latently fragile then, where are we now? Has the situation deteriorated? Have we moved into a situation of of being a failing state?
Yes. So I'm afraid to say that South Africa has moved from what I termed being latently fragile to being fragile. I know in some circles people think that South Africa is a failed state already. We have still a functioning bureaucracy, maybe not effective as it should be. And so while that functions, and while we can still have, as ineffective as the police service may be, due to a lack of effective leadership within the South African police service, it's still functional. I mean, you can still call a number and you can access a police station, and there'll be somebody on the other side of the line to take your call and listen to the complaint. So I definitely see that South Africa has moved from being latently fragile to being fragile. I would not, in my opinion, term South Africa as being failed at this stage, but we're certainly on track to becoming a failed state. It's very disconcerting to see the number of power outages in South Africa, and it's the extended period of time that people are without electrical power does not bode well for our economy. No economy can function without power, and that's very disconcerting because that, combined with high unemployment rates, sort of feed into each other and exacerbates the economic situation in which South Africa finds itself. It also doesn't engender confidence in foreign direct investment, which South Africa desperately needs. So it is a concern to me.
So how would you define a failed state? We're not there yet, but how would you define that? How will we know we're in a failed state?
Yes. When the government has lost its legitimacy, when the citizens no longer have faith, no longer trust, when the government no longer can project its monopoly on power over all of South Africa's sovereign territory, when the bureaucracy fails, we then have moved into a state of being failed.
Generally, in your experience from your research, how long is the period between a state being a failed state and a state becoming a collapsed state?
Well, Chris, that's a very difficult question to answer because every situation is unique. It has taken, in my opinion, 10 years from when I conducted my study to move from being latently fragile to being fragile. And we are on the cusp of being failed in South Africa. So it becomes a factor of effective leadership. If the leadership realizes the nature of the threats, the threats to human security in South Africa, and addresses those by way of being effective as governors, I'm sure that the boat could be turned around and we could move towards becoming more stable. But if that's not done, if we don't have effective leadership, effective government, where the governed is being respected, or at least where the government respects the governors, where they have full control over law enforcement and the rule of law is being respected in the country and applied equally across the board. If that's not addressed in those ways, we certainly South Africa can find itself being a failed state soon.
And I know collapse state is absolutely the absolute worst case scenario, but if that happened, what would life be like for South Africans in this country?
It would be chaotic. You would not have law and order. It would be each man for himself. you need to think about access to water, food. The economy, the formal economy will have collapsed. We'll have an informal economy. Not that South Africa doesn't have an informal economy at the moment. It does, and it's thriving. And it's because people have withdrawn from the system. And of course, the government cannot tax the informal economy because it's informal. And so they make their best efforts to tax what they know is taking place. So you'll have warlords, such as what we have in Somalia, and they'll be in control of certain swaths of land in South Africa. So the monopoly of force is lost by the government, and there's no bureaucracy to speak of. The government buildings will be taken over by vandals, and will be a non-functioning society, each man to himself.
Now, as somebody who was intimately acquainted with behind-the-scenes politics as a diplomat during the time of national party rule, and then during the transition, and at the beginning years, during the beginning years of ANC rule, and as an academic, how do you think this worst-case scenario can be prevented?
Chris, the endemic corruption within the South African government has to be addressed. South Africa has recently been grey listed. This is not a very good development at all. Endemic corruption needs to be addressed. We need effective leadership. The government needs to regain lost legitimacy amongst all the citizens of South Africa. The client-patron network system, which is rife on the African continent. The euphemism being used in South Africa is that it's cadre deployment at the expense of merit appointments needs to be addressed. So once those are addressed and people can see there's a genuine effort, corruption being at the pinnacle of all of this, to address that, it will start to instill confidence in the government and confidence in foreign direct investments. And now I'm not talking about countries that have ulterior motives for engaging South Africa. There are countries in the East that are certainly looking after their own national security interests, that are after South Africa's rare earth minerals. And so their engagement with South Africa needs to be carefully managed, in my opinion. So those are some of the efforts that can be made, but it needs to happen very soon.
So you're saying we could be running out of time. Would that require a change of government, or do you believe this government could make the needed changes?
Yes. I say the following, that we need effective leadership, effective government. No, whether it's the existing government or a new one, it's really neither here nor there. It is effective government which can instill legitimacy to that government. So if it means a change, sure, let's do that. If it means the status, the current ANC government remains in power after the next general election, then fine. But let's change the direction of leadership. Let's embrace effective leadership. I've noticed over the years that the support for the ANC in general elections has declined. And as a matter of fact, if I just consult some of my stats over here, the number of people that citizens that have not participated in the general elections is of concern. In 2014, South Africa had 31.4 million eligible voters. The stay-away vote was 12.8 million. In 2019, the eligible voters was 35.9 million. And the stay-away vote increased from 12.8 million in 2014 to 18.3 million in 2019. That's not a good sign. These are voters that have become apathetic to what's going on in South Africa. And this contributes to the government's loss of legitimacy.
We have to conclude, but not without me asking you, have you personally lost hope and faith in our country?
I have not. All South Africans are resilient. And I believe that it's not too late. I believe that with the overwhelming indicators that we are heading very quickly to becoming a failed state, that sober thoughts will prevail, and that leadership will step up and fill their role of effective leadership, root out the endemic corruption within the ranks of not only government, but also the corporate world. I think that is a good first step in the right direction to turning this boat around and staving off becoming a failed state towards becoming a more stable state.
That was Dr. Edward Mienie from the University of North Georgia in Atlanta. Thank you very much for sharing your research and your views with us, Doctor.
Thank you, Chris. My pleasure.